Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Show with Bill Hull. The show about stuff most people try to avoid, but can't because it controls their lives. Religion, culture, and politics. Why does Bill Hull host this show? Because he and Bonhoeffer hoisted a few brews together in Berlin. Nope. That never happened. Is it that Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, both challenged and changed Bill as a young man? Well, yes, that is part of it. But it's primarily because Bonhoeffer called us to a costly discipleship, and there has never been a time when such courage has been more absent or desperately needed than now. Bonhoeffer famously said, "Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ." The Bonhoeffer Project is committed to turning leaders into disciple makers. Because if leaders fail to create disciple-making movements, then we have failed. So, ladies and gentlemen, here he is. He's still tall and good-looking. And yes, he is wearing German cologne. He's acquired a few more underlying conditions. But direct from his underground bunker in Long Beach, California, the man who once told Don Henley, "You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave," Bill Hull.
Hello again. This is Bill Hull, and this is the Bonhoeffer Show. Yes, I'm just one guy on an island, my own virtual island, talking to myself and to those who care to listen. Today we're talking about deconstructing the empire of lies. You know, when you talk about that verse of scripture in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, where we take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, and that we deconstruct all the false arguments that keep people from knowing God. Well, that is a war of ideas. It's a battleground. It's where we live, and especially as leaders. And so Satan has provided and built an empire of lies, his own Tower of Babel, where it is programmed into all of society, even into the human spirit and mind. And so we are vigilant as believers to engage in this battle, deconstructing the empire of lies. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you might remember, won the Nobel Prize in 1974. He was able to receive it immediately after he was exiled out of Russia, after he was let out of prison. There was an interim where he was free, but he'd been in what he called the Gulag. In fact, he was in the Gulag archipelago, which is a string of hundreds of islands throughout Russia, where that was essentially in prison camp. And he was in prison camp for 8 years for being a counter-revolutionary and engaged in counter-revolutionary activity, which is what happens in these utopias, which become dystopias, which become prison camps, which become death camps. And he wrote this famous book, the Gulag Archipelago, and he detailed all the suffering and all those kinds of things. And it was kind of interesting. He's a very interesting man. And then when he actually was exiled and came to the United States, and I think he lived in New Hampshire, in 1978, he gave a commencement speech at Harvard University. And when he did, the interesting part was they didn't like it because he talked about God. He talked about that God was the source of truth, that he was talking from a Christian worldview, in fact. And this is the famous statement he made, that the line between good and evil, it wasn't societal, it wasn't tribal, it wasn't systemic, The line between good and evil went right down through the heart, the center of a human heart. And they just didn't like that idea, because then you're dealing with sin and everybody being a sinner, and that we all have sinned and fall short of God's standard and his glory. But this was Solzhenitsyn. And here's what Solzhenitsyn said, because he knew something about an empire of lies. He lived in an empire of lies, the Soviet Union. He says, to do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he is doing is good, or else that there is a well-considered act in conformity with natural law. In other words, I have to believe this is good. You know, there's a general malaise and moral confusion of the culture in which we live, and it reminds me of what St. Francis of Assisi said. Not that St. Francis and I were buds, but he said he would need to go to the city center in Assisi and stand on his head to see the world aright, because the world was upside down. The early Christians were given credit for turning the world upside down, in the King James Version anyway. And it says that the Christian worldview required everyone outside the Christian faith to stand on their heads to make sense of things. But now the world is back where Christians found it. And now they find themselves, along with St. Francis, standing on their heads. I know I have to stand on my head to see things are right. Light has been declared darkness. It's interesting how people who at once were clearly in the wrong have now assigned themselves the high road, and they are in the right. And they lecture now those who were formerly in the right. Yeah, it's odd. Light has been declared darkness, and darkness declared light. Right is wrong, wrong is right, up is down, down is up. You know, the old greeting, what's up, requires the answer, who knows? Depends on your viewpoint. I don't find myself standing on my head as much as scratching my head now, befuddled as to how so many have gotten it so wrong. But as Solzhenitsyn said, apparently they have construed their actions as good. You know, when you watch elected leaders attempt to prosecute people who use legally held firearms to defend themselves against protesters who threaten to burn down their home, but hundreds of looters are freed with no bail, you scratch your head. You really do. Now, you know, I'm talking about those two attorneys. They're white, they're rich, they got a nice big house, they're in St. Louis, and he's standing up there with an AK-47 in his front yard, his wife with a handgun. You know what? Those were legally owned guns. They were on their property. They were being threatened. Now, that's all legal, but it's bad optics, you know, because you have protesters out there who don't have that big house, who are a different color, and who have a different worldview, and sort of feel the right to go in and just destroy your house, which they had threatened to do. And those people, not one of them was arrested. But they actually tried to prosecute the attorney and his wife. By the way, those guns weren't loaded. Now, this only points out, and you can take whatever position you want, okay? But what it really points out to me is how crazy things have gotten, where the lawbreakers are the victims. And the people who are being violated in that case are the demons. They're the evil ones. It's right is wrong, wrong is right, up is down, black is white. So you scratch your head, and when a mayor of a world-class city like Seattle allows anarchists to take over the part of the city, and they require it, they call it a festival or a summer of love, you scratch your head. When leaders decide that Marxist socialist movement has a right to protest during a pandemic, tear down statues, attack police, and destroy public property, but schools must remain closed because we can't deny the protesters their rights, you start scratching with both hands. then marijuana dispensaries remain open, along with liquor stores, because people can't live without them. But churches are considered non-essential. You just put your head in your hands and moan. The irony is almost laughable. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not saying it's a bad idea to keep people from coughing on one another and violating basic health rules in a pandemic. That's not my point. My point is, what do you consider essential and non-essential to the human condition? In previous articles or programs, I've quoted Charles Malick. I'm very fond of him in his little book, The Two Tasks, which I have right here somewhere in my International Nerve Center. But the important words that are, he says, our challenge is to win souls, but also to save minds. And I think that the church has done better at the soul part than the mind part. And what I'm suggesting is that as we reinvigorate this idea of making different kinds of disciples in the dystopian age, is that these different disciples are going to be different because we are going to have them more equipped in the mind to engage in the conversation and into the issues that we face when we go to work, live, and play every single day. If we lose the minds, we've lost the souls. As a result, the culture, the battle, the war. So what is our defense? Even better, what is our offense? Well, I learned early on as a basketball player that defense must be played. But putting the ball in the basket is what they count. So this is where the Apostle Paul's words to the Corinthian church community comes into play. What really counts here? We are human, but we don't wage war as humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons that knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and destroy false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. Remember again, just want to keep repeating this, it's what keeps people from knowing God that's wrong, that's evil, that we need to deal with. We capture their rebellious thoughts. Who's rebelling? Those people who do not want us to know God. Who doesn't fundamentally want us to know God? Lucifer. He's come to steal, to lie, to destroy. We capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. All right, now I've started off strong here, so let's do this. Let's take a break. Let's hear what Steve Simmons has to tell us about the Bonhoeffer Project. Remember, we turn leaders into disciple makers. This is what our passion is. We're doing it all over the world. We're doing it, it's multiplying. Even during this pandemic, we've had a surge of new cohorts. And so listen to about this. Go on our website, thebonhoefferproject.com. You'll find all kinds of things about books, videos, testimonials. We have some great testimonies that we've just recently captured. And also about where you can get involved in the cohort very soon. All right, so we'll see you in a while.
We turn leaders into disciple makers. That's the mission of the Bonhoeffer Project. But before we can turn you into a disciple-making leader, we need you to be in a cohort. A cohort is a 1-year, 10-meeting, book reading, praying, wrestling, writing, planning challenge that has the potential to change you and thus redirect your life. Interested? Here's the process. Go to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com, and complete the application form. We will contact you. We will then help you select the type of cohort that's best for you. In person, online, or online school, which is asynchronous, so it's not affected by time zones and anyone in the world can access it. Oh, and training is now also available in Spanish. In the meantime, subscribe to the show, read one of Bill's books, and send us a question you want Bill or some member of the Bonhoeffer team to answer. And now, back to the show.
Well, thank you, Steve. And I think I told you on the last program about why you should buy my books. My wife bought a new freezer. Now she wants to go to Hawaii. So we have a new book for you. It's called The Cost of Cheap Grace, written by me and the co-founder, my good friend, Brandon Cook, who, where is Brandon anyway? I'm not sure. He moves fast. But he's out there writing a poem or taking a photograph or writing an article or maybe actually writing a book without me. That wouldn't be good. But anyway, The Cost of Cheap Grace by Bill Hall and Brandon Cook, Reclaiming the Value of Discipleship. Good book. And my wife gets to go to Hawaii. All right. Now, back to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. And what we have here is this passage about knocking down strongholds of human reasoning and destroying false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. All right. Now let's just go back to the history of what was going on in Corinth at the time that Paul wrote this. The Corinthian church was new, small, and culturally unimportant. But it was located in a large and important city. The church may have only had 30 people, 40 people, who knows? The city had been destroyed, but it was rebuilt in 44 BC by Julius Caesar after the desolation of war. It was located on a small isthmus that saved sailors weeks of sailing. They could just move all their goods and services quickly across this simple, short strip of land and save weeks. Therefore, it was a busy cosmopolitan seaport that brought the best and worst to this tiny strip of land. The new Corinth had some of the staples of the old Corinth. Back were the temple of Aphrodite, which had been destroyed, along with the Roman gods. The church was primarily composed of Gentiles who had been trained to glorify wisdom. Think about 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 2. Ecstatic utterance, eating meat sacrificed to local gods, promiscuity, and prostitution. They had it all. What happens in Corinth, they said, stays in Corinth. Well, maybe they didn't say that. But the temple of Aphrodite provided one-stop shopping with its hundreds of prostitutes, juicy steaks, and Viking cruise level lectures on pop philosophy and culture. If anything, the church at Corinth had less to hold on to culturally and historically than we do now. So don't think of it as a more conservative culture. Don't think of it as an easier culture to be Christian in. It was more difficult than American culture, clearly, or Western culture, even now. They had I know that Leslie Newbigin said that Western culture today is the most resistant culture to the gospel ever, apart from Muslim culture. And we know what he means. It's secularism, nihilism, and so on. Yeah, it's difficult, but it was no less difficult in Corinth. They had no unified Christian worldview or culture to stand on or to compare with what they were experiencing. The 10 Commandments are posted, let's say, in the United States, in different places where it still remains, where it hasn't been taken down. In the Supreme Court of the United States, the 10 Commandments are posted. The Bible was in the process of being written at this time. Orthodoxy was 300 years into the future. You couldn't even say, oh, I'm Orthodox, or I'm not Orthodox, or I'm neo-Orthodox. All they had were Paul's words and their lived experience. They were learning as they went along. So Paul and his rivals were their only lifeline to make it in the culture that worked against them in every part of life. So what happens with the Assyrians, the Assyrians won in history. And so what happens when the Assyrians win is what happens when the wrong political party gets into power, depending on your political orientation. Or what what country is dominant, who's running the world at that time. That is why Paul encouraged them to keep it in perspective. He said, the message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction. But we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. As the scriptures say, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and discard the intelligence of the intelligent. So Paul didn't tell them to hide in the castle and pull up the drawbridge. He said in the second letter to them, let's go on offense. So he says, we are human, but we don't wage war as humans do. So I think that we are at war, and we need to take a cold, hard look at what confronts us in the 21st century. Our opponent isn't interested in truth. And I'm not talking now, again, politics, when I say this. Because our opponent is a he. He has no interest in a national conversation on race, justice, poverty, capitalism, socialism, abortion, school choice, or even what is right and wrong and why it's right or wrong. Truth doesn't matter to our enemy, for he is a liar, the father of lies. He is only interested in winning, winning, winning. He has come to lie, to kill and destroy, to steal. He lied and tempted Christ in the wilderness. He is after one thing, to destroy what God loves most, his creation. And even though he knows that he cannot win, he will fight to the death, knowing that even if he loses, at least he can take millions of dead corpses with him. And that hurts God. Paul understands this and stands a bit straighter and sticks out his chest and says, we are going to take down Lucifer's empire of lies. That's what we're unstacking. That's what we're taking apart. Now, most of Most of Lucifer's disciples don't know they are his disciples. This is why it's so dangerous. In fact, he is the great deceiver, and he convinces them through an elaborate system of lies, images, and emotions that they are doing good. In fact, they believe they are morally superior to the Christians and are calling on Christians to repent and to confess and to shut up and to listen and to cancel and deny and remove all that we have and our ancestors have done wrong. You know, Christians hate, but they love. Christians are intolerant, but they are open-minded. Christians repress the true glory of humanity. They, however, want everyone to flourish and express their full potential. They believe Black lives matter too. Oh, yeah. And when pressed that all lives matter except for those millions of unborn innocents that are killed year after year, decade after decade, but there is money to be made on their tiny little parts. But that is different because women need their freedom to conduct their lives any way they want without reality or reaping or taking responsibility. The battle is on, and the battlefield already has 2 dead corpses, truth and reasoning. So how do we begin? We must use our own special weapons that the enemy doesn't possess, that oddly enough will. Knock down and destroy their strongholds of human reasoning and destroy their arguments. That's what the biblical text says. So what weapons is Paul referring to? Well, these words have been used to launch apologetic ministries. They have inspired our greatest minds to write books. So engage the enemy's best and brightest. Isn't that what Malik referred to when he says, if we lose the mind, we have lost the soul? So it is true, you can't bypass the mind if you want a whole person who understands the reasons for their own actions. But Lucifer has done a spectacular job of getting vast throngs to watch 500 episodes of The Simpsons, Seinfeld, Friends, or some other repeatable series that will cause you to bypass your mind and go straight away to programming your emotions, to be cynical about life, to have life without meaning, but at least you can have sex with anyone you want. And then get an abortion because you might not get promoted if you miss too much work. So Paul's immediate context is his authority with the Corinthian church. His words, I believe, concern what will expose the lies of his opponents. It will be the truthfulness of his life. His belief in prayer and the full armor of God is detailed in Ephesians chapter 6, 10 through 18. He believed that when he arrived, his personal presence, his anointing from God, the power of God working through him, would destroy all their arguments. This is the underlying assumption of his words. He is speaking of the intangible of spiritual authority and presence. So part of the divinely powerful weaponry here is the spiritual authority and presence resident in the believer. In that immediate context, this issue for Paul was of first importance. This is of equal importance to us right now as we interact with those we meet personally, because essentially that's where most of the action is anyway. It's not going to, most of us aren't going to be on television. We're not going to have a podcast. We're not going to write a book. We're not going to speak at a political convention. We're not going to be appointed by the President of the United States to do something special. No, we're just going to be living our lives and interacting with people and having dinner and having conversations and taking walks and sitting around the barbecue. It's what really happens then that matters, because you can actually turn a person's life around if you do that right, if you stand up and be counted, if you don't allow them to shut you up, to intimidate you, to cancel you. Courage. You see, this is the component that is missing in the 21st century church. Courage. All right, it's time for a break. Time to hear more about how you can subscribe and be a part of the Bonhoeffer Project. So, Steve, take it away.
If you want to expand the disciple-making movement, then share the show with your friends and colleagues. Hey, it's easy to subscribe. Simply go to iTunes or to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com. Then click on The Bonhoeffer Show. Once you do, we will keep you updated with the Bonhoeffer Project's events, new materials and books, as well as the larger disciple-making movement current news. You can also access previous programs. And be sure to read Bill's weekly column, which is posted on the website. Remember, ask questions. Bill's answers are guaranteed to give you herd immunity, increase your IQ, and cause you to experience waves of euphoria. Well, not really, but his answers are really good. And now, let's get back to the Bonhoeffer Show.
Thank you, Steve. So, the 90-10 rule. The 90-10 rule is something that I just made up, but it's an observation. And that is, I think about 90% of the people that are protesters, people who in general are people who are thinking normally, who have naturally good impulse. I think that when the press says that the protests are mostly, when the press says that when the press says that most of the protesters are peaceful, I think in general that's been true. Depends on the situation, of course, there are exceptions to that. But what I think essentially is going on there is those people have a good impulse and they're not out there to riot or loot or destroy or hurt anybody or kick them in the teeth. That's not their purpose in being there. And I think 90% of those people, if you say Black Lives Matter as the motto, most of those people would say, oh, yeah, I mean, I think that it's Black people have had a difficult time in our culture, and what we need to do is to give them a break. And in general, yeah, I mean, that's a sentiment that most people can have, and it's certainly legitimate. But the thing is that 90% are not running the show. It's the 10%. It's the instigators. You've heard the names, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, the organization. Just go to the website. That's all you need to do. Read about what it says about the family. Read what it says about traditional morality. Read about what it says about white guilt and all those kinds of things. And you'll get a good sense that they are not they are not for the way that this country has been established. They don't believe that this is a good country with faults, but it's an evil country that needs to be changed and changed dramatically. And essentially, they believe in insurrection. And I think that, to be honest, that's what it really says. That's what they believe. But what I'm also saying is that there's sympathy for these 90% of people, and they are not the protagonist. I think the 10% are the protagonist, and this is what we have to be, I think, alerted to. They're the ones who want to remake America. They're the ones building this new Tower of Babel for the purpose of holding both political and cultural power. And that's where they are angry and hostile toward their opponents and are ungoverned by moral principles. This is where Christians, frankly, we're at a disadvantage, because Christians, we're limited to tactics that are constrained by divine revelation. We are told we must fight fair. No lying, stealing, cheating, slandering, murder. Doesn't mean we have it, but it means that we don't endorse it. We're not for it. We don't have a manual that tells you how to do it better, like Saul Alinsky's book, the Rules for Radicals. So this removes many useful tools from our arsenal. So what is our goal, really? What can we do? And again, the reason I bring these things up is not because I think the battle can be engaged here, but really the battle is about ideas. It's about thoughts. It's about the internal person of Christ in us. It's about salvation and redemption and forgiveness. But today, what we're facing is this kind of new version of Christianity where a lament is a cultural lament, a cultural confession, and that like the book White Fragility, which is being read by the thousands, maybe the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions in this country right now, which essentially says, all white people are guilty and only white people are guilty. And the only way you can be absolved of your sin is to confess it to other people who are not white and to give them stuff, basically. So, and that's not a solution. That's not going to work. So we destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. To put it like the motto, our mission is to know Christ and to make him known. That is the focus of all our warfare, the activity we engage in. But in order to do that, we will need to destroy these proud obstacles and expose them and teach this through in the world. In fact, much of this information is inherent to the gospel. So when you say you know God, people are immediately suspicious. The wisdom of God seems like foolishness to them. When you show them Jesus turning over tables and screaming at the Pharisees, they are baffled how a peacemaker becomes so confrontational. The idea that a meek and mild Jesus one day will return to the world's last battle with King of Kings and Lord of Lords tattooed on his thighs, and he slays the nations with a word from his mouth. It blasts all their categories into smithereens. But first, before the apocalypse, we must live in this age of argumentation and disagreement, debate and conflict. What are some of the lies that have been constructed that keep people from knowing God? What are the empire of lies? Well, that's going to be the subject that we get involved in future programs, some of those particular lies. But what I want to do today is just simply focus to remember that when we deal with this issue of upstream, midstream, downstream, and different disciples, it's disciples who are willing to engage in this process. And in the Bonhoeffer Project, we turn leaders into disciple makers, and we want to create disciples who are relevant in life, in character, and in knowledge to be able to communicate with the generation in which we're living. All right, so that's it for today. Thanks for being a part of the program with me. And tell your friends about it if you dare do that. And remember, follow Jesus and he'll teach you everything you'll ever need to know.
Well, we hope that the show wasn't too bad. Jane Hull wants everyone to know that if anything Bill said was offensive, she feels your pain. If you were upset by anything Bill and his guests said, well, mission accomplished. At the Bonhoeffer Show, we value irreverent, satirical, and generally inappropriate behavior. But when it comes to fulfilling the Great Commission, we don't mess around. Remember, subscribe. We promise. No private jets, no white suits, and definitely no toupees.